Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. Yes, we are a bit late, and that's my fault, no one else's, and we won't hold you past the top of the hour. At least that's the current plans, depending on how well you do. It's good to have everyone with us today. It looks like we have all of our normal Bible students on camera, not to mention a good number of folks hanging out in the chat room who have joined us to study along as we discuss the Word of God. Good morning, gentlemen. Since we're starting late, we'll cut short all the niceties, and I'm assuming everybody's doing well.
Yes.
All right. Good to go. You know, someone who also did well sometimes and other times not so great was Peter. There was sometimes Peter stood strong, other times Peter kind of cowered away, but by the time he headed towards the end of his life, we really see a great bit of strength on the part of Peter and some sound teaching regarding how to deal with sufferings that may come from us doing that which is righteous. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at today as we continue our study. I think, guys, we left off, pardon me, having finished verse 12 last week. Was there any other final thoughts or comments on the first 12 verses?
This is a new SMS from Micah Duvall with the text I'm about to do.
Sorry. Trying to silence my phone here.
Other than that, no.
Okay. So it's interesting that he's been talking in the preceding verses there that we're looking at, the salvation that we have in God. He begins with verse 3, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ," and offers up, if you would, a praise unto God, and recognizing those things that God has done for us. And concerning this very salvation in verse 10, he talks about how even the prophets would have desired to have known more about it, but they were unable to. But they revealed these things unto us, and that's what we're abiding by, and that's what instills our faith today. But picking up in verse 13 there, he seems to be preparing. What is about to follow appears to be trying to help shape Christians to prepare themselves for those times when we may face sufferings, when our faithfulness as Christians are challenged in the way that we're supposed to behave and be living there. So let's pick up with verse 13. And Eric, how would you feel about reading for us today?
Sounds great. English Standard Version?
Yes, let me catch up with you here, and I'll share that.
Through 21, maybe?
Yes, yeah, actually that would work out very well. Work out very, very well. And whenever you're ready.
"Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.' And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God."
All right, thank you, Eric. All right, so it is interesting in the English Standard Version when you look back up to verse 13 there, that he begins this section as divided for us by saying, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that is brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." In a moment he's going to talk about, of course, us being holy, and he'll use the term holy several times within this particular reading here. But in verse 13 he talks about a preparation of ourselves and a mindset that is going to be necessary to establish a hope upon the grace of Christ. Are we talking about a Christian that takes everything super seriously? Or are we talking about a Christian who sets his mind upon serving God faithfully? Well, what are your thoughts about that and the preparation there of the mind in verse 13?
Well, John, one of the qualifications of one who serves as a shepherd or pastor or elder is that he's to be sober-minded. And sometimes I know that when I like to joke around when I was being considered for that, and there are multiple of us on here who serve in that capacity, that we, we can't joke around, we can't have lighthearted conversations and things. And I really think it's a contextual thing, that when it comes to this, I'm reading on the New King James, girding up the loins of your mind. When it comes to focusing on salvation, keeping our mindset with a realization of what's important, that we're serious about that, not that we can never laugh or enjoy some humor, but instead we realize what things are important and what things we have to get serious about, and that we have the capacity to be serious about those things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
John,
I think, like you said, contextually, it's going to really be necessary that we do that. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
Tom, go ahead.
yeah. Oh no, go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to make the observation. As we are reminding ourselves in this letter, Peter is reminding these brethren about the suffering that they are going to endure and so on. And I know over the course of the past couple of years, I've been talking about going on to maturity as Christians, and one of the things that I've emphasized is a proper mindset. And the expression that I would use is make up your mind. You have got to make up your mind that you're going to do what's right. And I see that with Peter here at the beginning. He's telling them, you know what? You've got tough times ahead. Gird up your minds. And a part of that is making up your mind, making mental preparation, everything that is associated with, and Paul used the word, the mindset of a Christian, everything associated with that. Get your mental capacity ready to deal with this, because if your mind is not ready, you're not going to be ready to deal with the physical aspects of what's going to happen.
Okay. All right. Brian, let me ask you this question. Do you think there's any significance to why the ESV and the New American Standard Version would render it prepare your minds for action, as opposed to using the Greek girding up the loins of your mind?
Well, of course, the girding up the loins is an idiom that we don't use anymore, so I would imagine that what we're trying to do is to capture the essence of the idea. The idea, of course, is being ready well, I think for the rest of the verse, he's going to make it clear, be ready for the Lord to return.
Yeah. For that revelation there.
On the flip side, of course, this imagery of girding up the loins, really kind of ties into a common theme that's going throughout the letter, in focusing on the situation of Israel in the wilderness and how our situation is comparable to theirs. They were in the wilderness as sojourners and wanderers. And, well, we are those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout all these different places. They were in the wilderness, and it was just kind of this temporary passing through on the way to their inheritance. Well, we're in the same boat. We're kind of, we're trying to reach an inheritance. Right now, we're required to conduct ourselves in fear during the time of our stay on earth. He talks in chapter 2, verse 11, about how as aliens and strangers, we are to abstain from fleshly lusts, wage war against the soul. The idea is, just like Israel, we have a hope, and we have a hope of an eternal inheritance. We have a hope of a greater inheritance than they had. But we also have a requirement of holiness, just as they did. And in fact, he quotes from something written while they were in the wilderness: "Be holy, for I am holy." So there's a lot of that idea, and I think that these connections to Israel in the wilderness, this analogizing of Christians to those people who were sojourning all that long time ago. This idea of girding up the loins of your mind is just one more way of tapping into that image. They're to eat the Passover with their loins girded before they headed out into the wilderness.
Okay, all right. It is interesting that when you study through 1 Peter, you see that you have to make that comparison, because Peter hangs on it a good bit. But then what you brought to my mind was Hebrews 3 and 4, how that first generation perished in the wilderness, and so as David says, while it's called today, we still have the hope for that rest which remains.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments about verse 13?
I'll just add a comment. I recall a preacher years ago saying that the big reason that people fall away is they're not focused on what's coming. And I think that perhaps is a great theme to think about here, as that's going to be the driving force for the rest of us. I think verse 13 is setting us up for why all of these things need to be in our mind.
Yeah. To set your hope fully on the grace that is brought to you at the revelation.
Yes.
Of Jesus Christ. Yeah. That's a good point. Good point, Brian.
Maybe sometimes we need, as preachers or teachers, to explain some of these idioms if we understand them ourselves. And the picture there is something that would be completely unfamiliar to us, but in the type of outfits that they wore, which were, not like jeans, obviously, but they had long flowing garments. But whenever they would need to do some work, or if they had to run or go into battle, they would take some part of that sash or whatever. They would literally kind of hitch up the middle of it and wrap it around their waist and tie it off, and it would free up their legs to be more active. And so that idea of preparing for action is the way the ESV is trying to help us with the idiom that doesn't really translate well to our culture today. And probably a lot of people hear that and, gird your loins, and we don't really, at least maybe people in our audience won't understand the picture. And so it's probably helpful for us to every now and then stop and explain some of those things.
I've got a book called Bible Manners and Customs, and a couple weeks ago I was preparing a lesson on modest apparel, and I was trying to see what they actually wore back then so I could bind properly on the brethren today what should be bound. But anyway, it was interesting, though, the description of what they wore, even the Israelites. And you're right. There was definitely the important part of being able to, to pull together all the gathered material so that you could get out there and run or work or fight or whatever the need was. Yeah. And it was also amazing how few clothing items they actually wore, if you stop and think about it. And many times the rich was distinguished by how many clothing items they had and how well they were, decorated and everything with jewelry and all that. So definitely not the same as what we wear today. I mean, there's commonality between them. Like they had the inner garment, we have what we call our undergarments. Then they have the outer garments, and we have our shirts and our pants and dresses and everything. Then they would have their belt or what would go around their waist there, and so there's some similarities there. But
the similar expression in English would be to roll up your sleeves. We say that all the time, figuratively,
yes,
to mean prepare to get busy, get down into to do work or whatever. And even if someone was in they're going to fight or whatever, they're but it's that same idea of sort of getting your sleeves out of the way so your arms can work. It's just a different kind of clothing that we wear.
Yeah.
There's also the idea of protection here. As all of you know, King James is the one that I'm just too old to learn something else.
You helped write that, didn't you?
No. I was on the subcommittee, I guess, maybe. But at any rate, the phrase "gird up the loins" has to do with protection as well. Paul uses it in describing the armor that Christians must wear. Gird up your loins with truth. So this protection, when you think about loins, and I'm not going to be vulgar in any of this, but it is the reproduction area of the human body. And if truth is to continue, you've got to protect its ability to continue to reproduce in the minds of others. So that as Peter goes on here, he says, protect that truth, protect the reproduction of this very seed of truth. Keep yourselves sober, keep yourselves alert in it, and make sure that this hope is secured unto the end of your life, or the end of this benevolence of God, this favor of Him, that you can be brought up, that is to be brought up in you, that is to be made manifest in you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, no one still knows when Jesus is returning, but by the same token, this everyday battle of truth and righteousness is something that we have to promote, thus the reproduction of the truth in the minds of others. By the same token, it has to be protected, defended, and all of that. So the call to action, as the ESV shows it, is the exact same thing of being protective and yet being bold enough to realize this is our life. This has to be protected. This has to be promoted and defended at all cost. And thus, verse 14, the obedience comes to mind here.
All right. I appreciate that, Mike. I had some good thoughts I hadn't really thought about in relation to this.
I'd never thought of that either.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and flow on into the next verse as we have it divided up for us. And this kind of reminds me again of what Wayne mentioned in the comparison to the children of Israel, where one, he calls us as obedient children, tells us not to conform to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Now, you know, it's interesting when we think about God, we think about who he is, the creator, all that he's done. For someone to say we need to be holy like he's holy almost seems like an impossible task if we don't have a proper knowledge of the Word of God. Whenever we talk about the word holy, the Greek word there means essentially what?
Probably different.
So set apart.
Is it, you know, I mean, that's my understanding. Basically, to be set apart, consecrated. And so, in the description here of this, he's telling us to be set apart as God is set apart. You know, not in our own definition of being set apart, but as God himself is separate and holy, we too are to be like him. And he'll talk more about that in verse 17, the fact that we call upon him for help, why being holy is such an important aspect of our lives. Any thoughts, though?
I did a study recently. I did a study recently on different names for Christians, and what's interesting is that the most commonly used name in the New Testament is saint, which means holy one, which again points back to the nature of a Christian and putting on holiness in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Eric, what do you want to say?
There are groups who they have holiness in their name, and I was curious about that one time. But really, they emphasize this personal holiness, and I realized that probably is a neglected thing in some areas. You know, in some other groups, and hopefully not in our group. But we need to emphasize personal holiness. One question that I have for you guys is what's expected of us in being holy something that we are capable of? It seems to me that it is, and if that's the case, is it something different than God has always expected of his people in being holy? I mean, the quote is from the Old Testament. Are we held to a different standard, a higher standard, a lower standard, the same standard? What do you guys think about that?
Well, you know, there's a great book on the subject of holiness, which I tried to get us to study, called Leviticus, in which, well, there's a lot of discussion in that, and Peter actually quotes from it here. But in Leviticus, you see a lot of this, you know, you get a lot of food laws, you get a lot of regulations about personal cleanliness, you've got some other discussions about discharges from sexual organs, and, you know, all of this stuff, and in the midst of all of that, you have the sin offering, or arguably another way to translate it is the purification offering. And the idea is that, among other things, sin is envisioned as a kind of contaminant. It gets everywhere, it pollutes everything, and you have to constantly be offering these sacrifices to cleanse it and purify it. And as a people, we need to be clean. We need to keep ourselves clean. It's hard to do because you're constantly having to deal with the sins cropping up all over the place. You know, a lot of those physical things in the Old Testament are ultimately illustrations of a greater spiritual reality. And so that's, you know, that's the mindset that we need to learn about. You know, while we're not required to keep the food laws today, obviously, since the New Testament tells us very explicitly that's been abrogated, at the same time, we can learn things about what it means to be holy and about what it means to make distinctions between the holy and the profane, between the clean and the unclean, like the Lord told Moses and Aaron in Leviticus chapter 10. So there's a lot learning how to make distinctions between what is right and what is wrong, what God has considered pure and what has been considered contaminated. Those same principles are evident today.
Right.
Wayne, in that very same realm with this, go back to the word loins. The early Hebrews were not permitted to be sexually immoral. It was the penalty was death by stoning. And in this idiom, what Peter's saying is keep the truth pure by keeping yourselves pure in that same truth. Be protective of it. Don't infiltrate it with the customs and traditions of mankind. Don't infiltrate it with the desires of the flesh, be that the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, or the pride of life. Keep it pure, because the purity, the holiness that is within us, is that purity that's in Christ. And then you look at the fact that Paul repeatedly talks about how that Christ lives in us. The old man of sin in us has died. We're not to live our own flesh anymore. We are to live Christ in us. And anything else defiles this holiness.
Yes. There's a sense in which I think holiness is more emphatic now than it was before. Because, I mean, in the Old Testament, you have the temple, you have the priesthood, you have the sacrifices. But you get to chapter 2, and they start going on about how you as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices. It goes down in verse 9, it's the same thing. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. It's not that, you go to a temple where there's another priesthood that offers sacrifices on your behalf. It's now you are the priesthood, you are the living sacrifices, you are the temple, and you are the actual materials out of which it is constructed. So holiness is a more emphatic thing now. And in the same way, chapter 3, you get the same idea. Even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear their intimidation. Do not be troubled. But verse 15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. In other words, make Christ holy as Lord in your hearts. Right. Always being ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is within you. And then you see holiness and hope tied together again there. If we want to have hope, if we want to give a defense for that hope, we first must consider Christ holy. And if we are to consider Christ holy, we must be holy ourselves in our behavior.
Eric, coming back kind of to your question there, does that kind of address it, or what are your thoughts?
Well, the question is, some people have this idea, I think is mistaken, that we're all just rotten, and they'll misquote that passage from Isaiah that our deeds are filthy rags, which is misunderstanding the context of that statement. But there's this prevalent idea that we're the only difference between us and the world is that we're covered by the blood of Christ, and we have nothing of our own that's any good, and there's sort of elements of truth to that, but the bottom line is we are expected to be a holy people in reality, not just some kind of illusion because of Jesus Christ's holiness. But anyway, I'm still all working out in my own mind how to explain that. And is there a difference between, there was this burden that was on them that it seems to not be on us in some passages, but at the same time, I don't know that God expects any less of us than He did of His people of old. I think He always wanted His people to be holy as He is holy.
Do you think they could have known true holiness, though? I wonder if maybe I'm thinking as I'm talking. Do you think that was the real distinction? Is that they couldn't have perceived holiness? I think Wayne was kind of alluding to it, that there was a carnal holiness that they were familiar with, but we're familiar with a spiritual holiness. There's a
certain instructiveness, I guess. I mean, ultimately, of course, there's a lot of stuff that you can't know until Christ comes into the picture. Jesus just kind of, because He explained so much of what's ambiguous before. He explained so much of what's in the shadows and the types before. Now, I mean, as far as your comment goes about the, I guess the distinction between us and the world. I mean, there's a sense in which, there really is the point. All have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, and so there really is nothing separating us from judgment save the blood of Christ. And yet at the same time, there is a higher standard that we're called to because we've been sanctified, because we've been bought with a price. And chapter 4 really gets into that, I think. Since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same purpose. The time past is already sufficient for you to have carried out the desires of the Gentiles. They're busy pursuing things like sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, all the stuff that's unholy, and they're getting surprised at you that you don't want to do the same stuff. Well, why don't I want to do the same stuff? Because, well, I've been internally transformed by Christ, and that for that reason, I mean, the gospel has been preached. You've been transformed from within. I have a living hope, and that changes the way I behave. That makes me holy. That makes me want to be holy.
Well, it ties with the conviction. The difference between a faithful child of God and one of the world is conviction. The child of God is convicted, the word of God is true, and God must be followed, and God must be served so that we can have eternity with Him in heaven. So that naturally changes our lives because the conviction is strong enough for us to bring about the change. When you initially asked Eric the question, a couple of things, kind of passages came to my mind, and it's all about choice. You think about it, He told the children of Israel to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. It was an internal obedience unto Him. And then they had to work to keep themselves separate, as Peter will talk about here as well. Then I think about Mark 7, when Jesus considers what defiles a man. It's not what goes in the body, but what comes out of. So we've got an issue where, yes, we have the same potential as the ungodly people of the world, but our heart is set upon serving the Lord, and therefore we are willingly obedient to His word, not like those in Hebrews 10:26 who openly reject and disobey the word of the Lord. Might be a way of looking at it. But I think there is a demystification of the perception of holiness that really comes when you study the Word of God. And when you know about people who use holiness within their name, or your holy imminent one, or whatever, I think it's a misunderstanding of the simplicity of the separation that we bring about when we serve God and walk separate from the world. But I agree with what everybody said, though. I mean, it's all good points made within that. Any other thoughts?
And I guess we would all agree that God is not requiring anything of us that we're incapable of, right?
I agree with that.
He calls them to be like Himself, which is, both something to strive for and something that, is theoretically impossible because, on a practical level, who can be like God, right? Only Jesus has done that. And yet, we still have to strive for it. So.
But think about it, though. In all of the God's behavior, He's never behaved as the world. While we've been forgiven, we've been made holy by the blood of the Lamb, we can from this day forward strive not to be like the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll talk about that in the potential them remaining pure during this time of their exile, as we go on here with the next couple of verses.
Yeah, part of the call to be holy, he gives some motivation about that. He talks about judgment. He talks about living with a fearful respect of God, and realizing what great price was paid for salvation. Those things all motivate you to have that purity in your life.
That's a good point. Good point. Any other thoughts about that before we continue? How about the chat room? Have I missed anything?
Mostly just discussion about whether there's an echo.
I heard it for just a little bit, but I don't hear it right now, though.
Yeah, well, the person who's speaking when we hear an echo isn't necessarily the person causing the echo. So.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, I think, in verse 15 that he says, "Be holy in all your conduct," which means it's not some abstract concept. It is.
Right.
It manifests itself in our behavior. That's important, I think.
Well, it also goes back, Eric, to Colossians 3 and verse 17, which I take that verse as a verse that says that anything and everything we say and do must be done in the name or by the authority of Christ, so that our conduct is not meditated, if you will, by our own desires, our own thoughts. It's directed by what God wants us to do in every aspect of our daily life. Yeah, we're right to make choices, but the choices that we make have to be in accordance with His will, in a fashion by which the gospel is promoted to those that see and hear us. I talk to every sermon I preach to me first, and if brethren need it, they're welcome to join in the lesson. But the fact is, we forget sometimes that people look at us more than listen to us. These people that Peter directs these teachings to is exactly the same. They're Christians. In that day, that was an oddity still to the people that surrounded them, especially among Gentiles who had for generations worshipped in idolatrous ways. Now they're participating in a spiritual life that's much different than anything anybody's ever seen. They have to guard this truth. They have to live this truth very accurately, so that not only what they say, but what they do, where they go, with whom they participate, every inch of that is a difference from what they used to be. It's now demanded of them that their lives be holy, be, to put it into our modern day vernacular, to be extremely religious. Not to the point of being superstitious in our religion, as Paul said to the Athenians, but by the same token, very strict, that no matter what we say, no matter what we do, Christ is coming first in our lives, and we're going to prove that at all cost, even to the cost of our lives.
Mike, do you think that that's, at least a part of that is when, in verse 17, when he's talking about judgment, he says with the phrase "without partiality," that is based upon what we're really doing?
Oh, absolutely. There were so many prejudices in that day, even as there's prejudice today. We gear ourselves to customs and traditions. And to just put the onus on ourselves, think about our worship services. If you go into a place, Paul, to preach a meeting, or any of us go in to preach a meeting, we generally find ourselves accustomed to 2 songs, stand for prayer, another song, then we get in the pulpit. That's tradition. I went one place where after 2 songs, prayer, the 3rd song, I stood up, get in the pulpit. One of the elders said, "It's not your turn yet." And the tradition of those things was altogether different. Well, by the same token, if we gear ourselves to a pattern of tradition more than to the pattern of Christ in the church, then we've defied this truth that keeps us holy. It's a matter simply of being able to do what Paul said. Prove all things and hold fast that which is good. You're going to find that in verses 18, 19, 20, and 21 here, that anything about our words, anything about our deeds, we are to, without respect of humanity, keep ourselves in the love of God. Make our sojourning here in the fear of God. We're not to fear man who can kill the body. After that, there's nothing he can do. But fear God who is able to destroy both soul and spirit in hell. I honestly believe, brethren, that what we do with ourselves at times is try to make ourselves Christ. That's wrong. Make Christ appear in us is the right way. You're not going to change your facial appearances, your physical attire. We are what we are in our physical concept, but our mannerisms must be kept holy. We can't be of the sort that finds it all right to go into a bar and have a good time with everybody. We can't be of that. We can't be of the folks that want to party hardy and then get up on Sunday morning and go to church and say that everything's fine and dandy. You can't mix the world and the life of the Christian. That's a very difficult concept for people to understand. That's why a lot of people won't obey the gospel. Their whole lifestyle has to change. They don't want to give up the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. But if you go back to verse 14, that's emphatically what Peter said we left behind. You can't pull that into your life with Christ anymore and be holy. It's like you all said a little while ago. You got to make a choice. I like what Paul said in our Paul Adams, when we first began this discussion, that if you were to put a theme on 1 Peter, the theme would be stay focused. We can't let our minds wander for a moment. If we do, the devil's got it. And if the devil takes over, then what happened to truth? What happened to the loins of our minds? I don't like people saying that Christianity is an easy life. I've heard that preached. It's difficult, but it's difficult in the realm of fighting sin. It is the easiest, the lightest burden that you'll ever experience when you consider the fact that Peter says later on in our writings, or in his writing here, cast all your care upon him, for he careth for you. You get disturbed about wanting to be holy, give it to God. He'll carry that burden. You've got enough responsibility with keeping yourself right with God, and right with God.
Amen. As you look at that, Mike, I have to remind myself when I'm studying through something like this, and we teach in our generally Bible classes, and in a study like this, we're going through verse by verse. These epistles were written as letters that they would have sat down and read in one sitting. Now, there are instructions certainly that they might need to refer back to from time to time, especially in a letter like 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But this was a letter they were to sit down and read, and he begins off by telling them that they have an inheritance, incorruptible and undefiled, and that they're going to have to go through some hard trials to get to that. And it seems like the rest of this letter is helping to facilitate getting them to the inheritance through the trials.
Absolutely. And that's why he says, give your burden to the Lord. Let him carry the load. You've got enough responsibility in keeping yourself holy. I appreciate that, Paul.
And Indiana has kind of taken over this discussion, and so we'll hand it back.
Well, I don't disagree with what's been said. I think it's a very good point Mike made there, as well as Paul. And we'll build upon that as we look at verses 17 through 20 here in just a moment. But any of the other guys have a thought before we continue with that? Yeah, I wonder if the people who received Peter's letter, if they had a chance to see him again, said, you know, we've been studying through your letter that you wrote, and can you explain this statement, therefore preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded? It's kind of going back to what Paul said there, how we study it and break it down so much. So,
yeah, sometimes we get so close that we need to back off and see the whole book, the whole picture. Maybe just, you know, it would benefit us an awful lot just to sit down. How long would it take to sit down and read the 5 chapters of 1 Peter? Not very long.
10 minutes.
Yeah, so something like that, and just to read it with not with that. We ought to analyze God's Word. We ought to study to show ourselves approved. We ought to be searching the Scriptures to find out whether these things are so, things like that. But just to back off and see, well, when he wrote to them and they finished reading this, what would have been their impression? What would they have seen as something? What I really need to know from what Peter has said? And certainly, I believe every verse, every word, you know, the inspiration there. But sometimes we want to analyze so closely that we need to see a bigger picture.
It's cross-references. We've got the whole of the Bible to cross-reference, you know. And so you instead of, if you have a preacher that was, let's say preacher stood up there on a Sunday morning and preached from 1 Peter 1, 13 through 25, and spent his whole time talking about that section without cross-referencing any other verses, people might call him a weak preacher. You know, for some reason we see strength in being able to go for an hour and a half pulling all the verses possible that might relate to a subject when one is sufficient. Now, at the same time, the ones that gripe at are the ones that flower it with stories and personal anecdotes and stuff.
Well, I would agree with you, John. What we see here is, and if I were in my choice, I'd like to go through a passage like this, and I'll draw in some cross-references, but then let's read this, and then let's make some application, modern-day application. How in my everyday life can I factor this truth into my life? And I think there's great value in that kind of simple,
That's a good point.
Simple kind of discussion, and I'll hand off to Wayne because I think he's been waiting patiently.
Well, no, I mean, I think, just adding to what John has said, I've heard it described as the chicken and egg game. You're studying First Peter, and the preacher brings in Ephesians and Galatians and Romans and all these other things, and then that's all fine and dandy until you go study Ephesians, and he brings in First Peter and Philippians and Romans. And it raises the chicken and egg question: which book of the Bible do you have to understand first to understand all of the others? Because I mean, it may be that Peter's letter shows up somewhere, and well, Peter, we can't understand this because this other book hasn't been written yet. Well, yeah, that's not the way it was. It could be understood by itself. I understand the value of cross-referencing, certainly, and bringing in other relevant scriptures. But at the same time, it does help to see it as a collective whole and to see it as a big picture.
Yeah.
So if I cross-reference in 1 Peter, I think it's most important to pull other cross-references from 1 Peter itself.
Yeah.
I was going to say, we've emphasized, I know I've said it, and probably most of us here have said it, something only has to be said once to be true in Scripture. As far as that goes, granted context and so on, but a lot of times, and maybe I'm guilty of this because I like to quote multiple passages. Sometimes you think that with more passages it lends more strength to the argument, but that's not necessarily the case. Maybe another passage will help clarify an understanding of it, and that's the benefit of the cross references when it gives you a better perspective. Like for example, in this text, tying all of this together, verses 13 through 16. I think I mentioned a few weeks ago that we had a preacher, or Mickey. He was visiting with us on one of his lessons, preaching our gospel meeting. He made the point that he had heard that when you talk about the word priority, in reality, there's only one priority. We talk about priorities, but in reality, if something is a priority, it's above everything else. And when we talk about making up our mind, girding the loins of our mind, what we're determining to do is to be holy. That is the priority. And when holiness is the priority in our lives, we have access to the Father, which is what we find here in verse number 17, and all the other things just kind of fall into place as far as being what we need to be.
Okay. All right.
And incidentally, there are a few verses that were mentioned in the chat.
Yes. I only see two comments actually.
Yeah, two. There's two comments there by Jimmy.
All right, let me bring it in there, Tom, if you'd like to read those real quick. I'm glad you brought that to our attention. We're going to start with the
every move.
Yeah.
And go along with what we've been talking about. Jimmy just makes the point: your every move is going to be watched and used against you, and that's why we've got to be holy. And then the second verse he mentions: fear God and keep His commandments. And so those two things, two good passages to remind us of what's involved in being holy and the example we are.
Yeah.
See, I thought that first comment. I thought that first comment was just making fun of Brian.
Oh.
I don't know.
All right.
Well, we'll factor it into our truth anyways.
Yeah, there you go. Sometimes it was unwitting prophecy. It was unwittingly more true than no. I don't know.
Tom mentioned the fact of clarity, and there are times when cross references will add to the understanding of something. But I have seen preachers before in lesson outlines that made me wonder if they took a Thompson's chain reference and looked up all the Bible verses listed in under baptism and just threw them all out there in the sermon outline without giving consideration to the context of each one. And oftentimes we'll be in a Bible class and studying something or another, and someone will say, well, my Bible links to this verse, and so we'll bring in the cross-reference. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Sometimes cross-references are based on nothing more than a shared word or thought. The best cross-references are the ones you just you just get a Bible with no cross references and write them in yourself, and that way you can judge what is and is not relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. We are almost at the top of the hour. We did start late. If we wanted to, verse 17, he says, we could talk about real briefly verses 17, 18, and 19 if we wanted to, or do you think it might be better to reserve that for next week? I mean, it basically talks about motives, obviously, why we should be striving to live holy.
The time is short. I think we'll probably want more time to deal with them.
Okay. It is, as kind of a side note to reference maybe for next week, he began this letter in the ESV to those who are elect, and then in verse 17, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. To those who are elect exiles of the dispersion, and then he references throughout the time of your exile. And so we could talk maybe a little bit next week about, still it comes back to, I believe, the comparison, Wayne, that you made earlier at the start about the comparison between the children of Israel and us today. You know?
Yes. Yeah, there's more of that coming.
Yeah.
It's all over the letter, actually.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know maybe next week what you guys' thoughts are also on if Jesus' role as the Lamb is what was foreknown before the foundation of the world in verse 20. Is that what he's saying?
That's how I'm taking it. Okay.
Yeah, we can talk about that for sure. The way the ESV reads, it tends to point towards that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I would think.
I'm not sure if is there a controversy about that?
Not necessarily a controversy. I just want to make sure I understand it right. Do you guys agree that that's what? But we can talk.
Well,
I'm kind of jumping ahead. I'm just looking down.
Yeah, it looks like a good point.
Well, the thing is, it brings up a huge question mark. When you go back and you talk about the Garden of Eden and the sin in the Garden of Eden, you know, it really brings the whole Garden of Eden account into a different light when you read a verse like this. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
But we'll save that till next week. All right, let's plan next Wednesday to pick up with verse 17. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Verse 17 it is for next Wednesday. And some interesting things we can talk about clearly with that. We'll try to make a little more headway than we did today. I'll do my best to be here on time so I don't hold us up. And we should be able to make it to the end of the chapter, saving some, maybe having a few juicy morsels to really talk about there and work on. So, all right. Appreciate everyone joining us today. Let's see. Any final thoughts or comments, Brian? Let's start with you.
No, but I think we talked about one of the most important things about the Christian life, and that is being holy. And I think that what we talked about here, Mike made some really good comments about it, is that the idea of being holy isn't just the concept of performing the right acts in life, but it's also the abstinence from sin. And indeed, that's a big part of what it means to be holy. We can't just claim to be Christians and pretend that holiness then erases all the sin that we have. And I think that's a real practical, applicable thing for all of us to consider.
I agree completely. Eric, any thoughts?
I agree. Good discussions and good reminder of the life that we've been called to lead. Thank you.
Okay, Mike, any thoughts or comments?
I so much appreciate this study. You guys just increased my passion for this truth. I thank you for it.
Well, Mike, I appreciate your willingness to join us. I tell you, I picked on you a little bit, asked you if you were part of the King James translation team. I have a lot of respect for your age and your wisdom and your experience in the Word, so I don't want you to ever think that the respect is not there.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Tom, any thoughts?
I think it's all been discussed. It's about holiness.
Okay.
Appreciate being here, as always.
I appreciate you being here with us, Tom. And Paul Adams.
Well, you should also mention that we appreciate Tom's age and his wisdom, being one of the older among us. So, no, just appreciate. That's a joke, by the way. Appreciate everyone's discussion with us, and thanks for being here.
All right, and potentially the youngest. Wayne, any thoughts?
Oh, yeah, I think I am. So I appreciate everybody's great age and wisdom in this discussion, and I'm actually very thankful for the time that I get to spend studying with you guys. So, enjoyed it and looking forward to next week.
Appreciate it. I do too. And we'd like to thank you for joining us today. And I know it takes a lot of time. You may be busy with something. Maybe you're listening at a later point. We'd really like to thank you for your interest in things that are biblical, things that matter directly to our lives. Lord willing, we'll continue our discussion with verse 17 next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That would be noon in the Eastern Time Zone.
9 a.m. on the Pacific Coast.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
And if you're awake, 12 a.m. in Hong Kong.
And that's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.